Great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to see people joining from all over the world. Jamaica, Scotland, the UK, Belgium, Spain, wow. Different parts of the US, Canada. So we've got a good global audience. Really excited to be joined today for our first ever inaugural book club live, and we are really starting with a bang. We have two fabulous new authors that we'll be speaking to today, and I'm going to introduce them, of course, and also our wonderful and very experienced moderator, who I shall be shortly passing over to. However, first I just want to lay out how we're going to do this. We've just got an hour, so we haven't got a great amount of time, but enough of an opportunity to get a flavour of the experience of writing books on this topic of modern slavery and ask some really key pertinent questions. And thank you very much to those of you who already submitted your questions in advance for this event. We are hopefully live streaming on Facebook if we've managed to get that fixed. If you didn't have a chance to get your question over ahead of time, no problem. You can send them over in the QA facility on Zoom. And if we're on Facebook, of course, there. At the end of the event, we'll be announcing two winners who will each receive a copy of either Emily or Amelia's book. So hold on for that. If you're posting on social, please use the hashtag book club. And our handle is Freedom United HQ. So to start with, I'm going to introduce, and I'm very delighted to be introducing our moderator for this discussion, Baroness Lola Young OBE, herself a published author and former chair of the judging panel for the Booker Prize. Well, there are so many accolades, and I wanted to talk in particular about Baroness Young's important contributions in the fight against modern slavery in the UK parliamentary upper house where she sits, and notably introducing the offence of forced labour to the UK statute books. So, and that was back in 2009, but shockingly, up to that point, there was no offence of forced labour. So, Baroness Young, over to you. I look forward to this event. I hope everybody watching will enjoy it too, or have an opportunity once we've had the discussion to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and it's great to be here, even as we kind of look at this subject and think, where are we at the moment? And I can't think of any two people better placed to address that particular question. Where have we gotten to in this debate around, and I'm going to put modern slavery in inverted commas in the full knowledge that it's a problematic term, but where have we gotten to in terms of debate and action around this particular subject? Action which is to do, yes, with legislation, but it's also to do with NGO action, it's to do with individual action, it's to do with trade unions action, it's to do with the potential of actions across the piece. As far as I'm concerned, I always try to say that although we as consumers, or as citizens, as I prefer to think of ourselves, are implicated often unknowingly in these abhorrent practices, it's not our responsibility to change it. That's my position. However, I'm sure we can go into that and some other things in the hour that we've got available to us. And we've got, as I say, two extremely good speakers who also are both great writers, very accessible, very knowledgeable, and very robust in their writing. So I'm going to get straight into questions, actually, because as Joanna said, we don't have an awful lot of time, and I want to get to the nitty-gritty of it. And the first person I'm going to come to is you, Emily. And you've got this great book out, The Truth About Modern Slavery, which is slightly enigmatic title, maybe. I mean, how did you get to write this book? What was it that inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a really great question, and obviously it takes sort of going through various permutations to title a book, and this felt like really one that encapsulated what the book tries to do. The gestation of the book really, or the fuel of the book, was really frustration and anger, frankly, with how I could see through my work this idea of modern slavery that seems so kind of moral and something that we're all against and something we all want to fight, really being used to obscure the changes that are actually needed or legitimize really problematic policies a lot of the time. And my work on this is, I'm not the first person saying lots of this stuff, but it's predominantly been in an academic realm, you know, hidden away in those journals that none of us can access, or in books that are brilliant but not so accessible. So I wanted to create something really accessible to everyone that explained this. And really the reason the book is called that is that rather than exploring, say, the definition of the phrase modern slavery, which people have spent lots of time on, and or indeed, I do talk about specific cases, but it's not a kind of tour of lots of cases. What the book is really about is understanding that modern slavery is a particular story about severe exploitation. It's a particular way of understanding it. So it is a phrase, yes, but phrases evoke all sorts of things in our minds. And so it's a political story about exploitation. And that story benefits particular parts of society, of politics. So if, for example, I was a corporation and I had an advert for a car that meant you were going to, you know, have like the perfect spouse and the perfect children, you're not going to believe that, because you know what advertising is, you know that I'm weaving a story. But when it comes to something that seems humanitarian or that seems like a criminal justice issue, we can be quite bad sometimes at interrogating what we're being told. So I wanted to show how, if we think about exploitation in the terms provided to us by this modern slavery idea, we're often missing out crucial parts of the solutions that we need. And that's because the modern slavery story about exploitation is one that is about it as a kind of accidental evil, right? It's something that is perpetrated by individual deviants or an organized criminal gang. You know, it's these others, these baddies. And you see this in the language that's used a lot in kind of new abolitionist books and campaigns and stuff. So it'll be talked about, these are direct quotes, as a parasite, as a virus, kind of new abolitionist books and campaigns. That was strange. Did you, it's gone now, has it?
Yeah, yes, there was a strange moment there, but,
yeah.
but we could still hear you. So do carry on, please.
Yeah, so it's understood as a parasite, as a virus. People say we need to inoculate people against it. We need to scrub supply chains clean. Those are all direct quotes, and they all do the same thing, which is to portray to us that exploitation is this aberration, this anomalous thing, rather than something of the socio-economic fabric itself. It's like a stain on top of it. We just need to scrub it away. Freedom, liberation, you know. And likewise, obviously, the phrase modern slavery is very much asking us to think about historical slavery when we think about exploitation. Like it's quite a strange thing to say anyway, because it seems so obvious that we're calling this thing modern slavery, but it's something that people have made up, this phrase, right? And it's
good that you raised that, Emily, because actually we've got a question around that a bit later on. So if I may, can we return to that later?
Yeah,
one of the questions that's submitted, and I'd be very well. I think I know your position on this because I've heard you talk about it before, but I think it'd be good if we could incorporate that question later on. So sorry to interrupt you, but the only other thing I just want to say quickly before I go to Amelia is, do you think it's sort of inevitable that once an idea has, as it were, bedded down like modern slavery, so it was new, let's say 10 or 15 years ago, or newish, and now it's bedded down, we're ready to be more critical about it? Do you think, to what extent is it, do you think, part of that cycle of, you know, becoming familiar with something and then really needing to interrogate it?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think it's particularly a very astute point with regard to campaigning tactics. You know, as I'm sure lots of people on this call, anyone who cares about Freedom United's work and yourself, like, you have to find ways. How do you communicate these things that have to change? How do you cut through? How can you be sticky with people about these topics? And then you start to find, actually, we're playing into the wrong things, or it's being co-opted. In fact, I think UK politics is a really interesting example of this at the moment, because we keep seeing the current government using the literal phrases of campaigners. So with migration today, we have our Home Secretary saying this phrase, safe and legal routes, which is what campaigners against current migration policy have been saying for ages. So exactly, and that's how politics and campaigning works, and it's part of what we have to do.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a well-known political strategy, which I'm sure I've engaged in at some point as well. I want to move now just to bring Amelia into the discussion. Again, it's about a sort of learning cycle, Amelia. We're learning more and more, and the more we learn, the more awful it is, about what's happening to the Uyghur in Western China region, which is also known as East Turkestan. So could you say a little bit, Amelia, about what led you to writing a book on this topic when not many people were paying attention to it? It's now kind of on people's lips, but when you were writing about it, that wasn't the case.
Yes, my book focuses on one form of modern slavery, which is the forced labor situation in China. Yes, China actually has the largest forced labor system that is in place today across the country, but the Uyghur region definitely is an area where the labor camps are expanding at a rapid pace. You know, I started working on this book in about 2016 because I felt that even though every now and then we may hear a news story about an SOS letter being found in a product that was made in China, written by the political prisoner oftentimes that had made it. It's usually a news story that gets some headlines and some viral coverage, but rarely does it ever lead to any kind of systemic change. Similar to what Emily was talking about. There's rarely a look at the systemic issues, whether it's on the supply chain level, corporate level, or policy level, that fundamentally addresses or looks at all the different factors that make it easy for things manufactured in a forced labor facility in China to end up selling at stores all over the world. So I really wanted to not only look at that, but also tell the human stories of the people in these camps, whether it's, you know, there's such a wide variety of populations in these camps. There's obviously the Uyghur detainees, which are an ethnic group in China that is Turkic and predominantly Muslims, and they're a huge target in these camps. There's also underground Christians and Falun Gong members, a lot of religious activists. There's also pro-democracy activists, women's rights activists, the human rights lawyers that defend these people. And what you're seeing with the mass detaining of the Hong Kong activists, they're very vulnerable to being placed in these forced labor situations, manufacturing goods for the world, essentially. So my book explores the different types of people in these camps, how they landed there, and their connections to us as global consumers and our global governments.
So, you know, these things aren't new, as you know better than most of us, and some of these issues have been raised before, back in the 90s or whatever. Why is it, do you think, that you know, politicians will pop up then and say, this is a disgusting outrage, and and then it all goes quiet until the next time, as you say, you know, somebody sends a note and it becomes viral or whatever. Why do you think it is that there's this lack of consistency in actually addressing the key issue that's driving these various forms of enslavement, if you will?
Yes, that's a great question. I think ultimately it comes down to corporate lobbying. You know, there's been some attempts, I can speak to the US government, that attempts to pass legislations and agreements with China to hold China accountable for using this large group of forced laborers to produce the world's goods. Unfortunately, each time we've tried to move forward with these types of legislation, there's usually a lot of heavy lobbying that we receive from corporations, including as recently the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which would aim to ban all products from the Uyghur region in China, which is a region that human rights organizations and the US government have agreed that there's no way for a company to verify a product wasn't manufactured by forced labor due to the amount of surveillance and the tightness of the security there, and just the high number of people detained in these camps in that region. And so this legislation would aim to ban all products from the Uyghur region just to be safe, that we don't have anything made by Uyghur forced laborers, which is something associated with the genocide. It's associated with prevalent sexual violence against women. These camps are associated with a family separation policy. We as consumers around the world don't want our products associated with these things. And I think there's a lot of demand on the consumer side to ban all products from the Uyghur region, also known as Xinjiang or East Turkestan. But unfortunately, companies like Apple and Nike have been putting significant money into lobbying against this legislation, into watering it down so that it's essentially becoming more and more meaningless and non-binding. And unfortunately, it seems to happen over and over again whenever we do try to move forward to address the issue systemically.
So, I mean, and this is a big question, and in fact, somebody flashed up a question came up on the screen just now, but I was going to ask you anyway. If we say that as citizens, we have some kind of responsibility, some kind of ethical obligation, how do we exercise that responsibility? So, for example, you've just said that Apple and other companies have been lobbying against this piece of legislation, which in itself may not even do exactly what you want it to do, but maybe better than nothing. So what do you do? Do you purge your household of Apple goods? Or, I mean, what is it that we can do? Is there anything that we can do that can help to change the situation?
Yes, I think there's actually a lot that we can do. And it can start with these small actionable steps. Some great organizations are the End Uyghur Forced Labor.org. Labor is spelled the UK way, LABOUR, and including Freedom United has been promoting these great call to action campaigns where you boycott or call out a couple companies at a time. Right, there's currently a campaign against promoting people to call out Zara and some other companies that are, unfortunately, they've known for more than a year that a couple of their suppliers are using Uyghur forced labor. There's hard evidence that there's a connection there based on including government records. It's a pretty damning report published by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Despite having this information for more than a year, there are companies that say, oh, we conducted an internal audit and found no evidence of forced labor, so we're not going to drop that supplier. Unfortunately, what my book does detail is that the auditing system that a lot of companies conduct in China is extremely flawed. A lot of them are pretty basic, and they only look for things like the cleanliness of the factory and the quality of merchandise. They cannot detect something as complicated and hidden as unauthorized subcontracting to forced labor camps. And so we as consumers have to start holding our companies accountable by saying, we know that that's often an empty statement. You conducted an audit and found no evidence of forced labor, that we cannot buy that anymore. We would like to see you either conduct more thorough audits and release more information about what you look for in your audits, or better yet, pull out of the Uyghur region and drop the specific suppliers, especially that we know are associated with Uyghur forced labor.
Thanks very much for that. I'm going to go to Emily now and sort of pick up on this question of as to whose responsibility it is and what we should be doing. So if we think, Emily, that there's, you know, we're saying, oh, on the one hand, the consumer or the citizen has a responsibility to call people out or to check where their goods are made or whatever, but not to be passive. But then on the other hand, people like me will say, well, it's down to businesses to reform and to do better on this and to, as it were, call themselves out and not rely on unreliable audits and so on and so forth. But then again, the legislation that's designed to encourage businesses to be more ethical, is that working? And you know, could it be made to work better? I mean, it just feels like a really big conundrum. Emily, can you solve that for us?
Sure. Yeah, I think that I have quite strong views on this, and I think consumers are obviously relevant. You know, we want to, many of us, not everyone, wants to live ethical lives, and therefore, of course, we have a kind of moral responsibility in that regard. I think, however, our potential impact as consumers is limited and bounded in particular ways. So yes, I think we can have a powerful impact in terms of small high street independent businesses, right? So those ones that can feel our footfall disappear when we withdraw our custom. And yes, I know from working with lots of big brands that those emails from customers can strengthen the hand of people internally who are seeking to champion ethical issues, for sure. However, you then have to ask the question, well, to what end? What action is then being taken? And what's happened in the global economy is this this turn towards voluntary action on the part of businesses. This, you know, regulation is bad, it's burdensome, and the answer should be businesses choosing for themselves what they do. And that's all packaged up neatly in something called CSR, corporate social responsibility, which is essentially voluntary action taken by businesses to mitigate their impacts. But CSR, these voluntary measures, never touch the business models of the businesses themselves. Almost, you know, uniformly, they will not touch it. So yeah, audits being like one of the absolute key things. And then you have obviously this whole industry making money off audits that don't work, which is maddening. And I think in a way, the consumer thing, it's really problematic. The Uyghur issue is slightly distinct because it's so geographically specific. That maybe there are ways of blocking those imports, of cutting off particular suppliers. But on a more, on a wider scale, you have politicians using consumers, making consumers responsible tactically on purpose. Because if we are responsible, we do not look to the state to introduce effective regulations. So you had, for example, our previous Prime Minister in the UK, who talked globally a lot about modern slavery, Theresa May, made a speech where she said she wanted slavery, she wanted shopping from somewhere that has slaves in its supply chains to be as socially unacceptable as using a disposable coffee cup, right? And it's such a ridiculous logic, because how do you know that I'm using a disposable coffee cup? Because you can see it in my hand, right? You cannot, there is no equivalent with regards to exploitation in supply chains. And what we've done in the UK and in California, Australia's done it, more countries are doing it as we export this legislation, is require large companies to publish statements annually saying what they're doing. I know you've worked on this a lot, Baroness Young. What are they doing to tackle exploitation in their supply chains? But the problem with that is the only thing that's mandatory is the statement. There is no actual mandatory action, because again, it's this voluntarism that we are obsessed with. Our kind of global political economy is just obsessed with letting companies dictate their own solutions. And of course, what that means is we end up with window dressing. We end up, like Amelia says, with audits that really, even sort of better audits, aren't really working. And the whole thing is tilted in the direction of business as usual, in the direction of protecting business models, and never in the direction of giving workers themselves more power, supporting them to act collectively, enforcing their labour laws. And in some ways, the anti-slavery movement has played into this, because what you'll often find is funders, for example, funding anti-slavery things, will fund like specific supply chain investigations, things like that, rather than supporting in-country efforts to improve labour laws or to get it legal to unionize in countries where it's not, and so on. So we sort of play into this game where it's treated as this aberration that can be plucked out by companies just like doing a little bit over here if we as consumers push them enough, and it's just not true.
Just briefly, Emily, could you, because we're going to shortly go into the questions from people around the world. Just briefly though, before that, what do you think? How do you think we can move forward on this? Because I totally agree with everything you've said, particularly about the legislation. And although we're trying to strengthen that step by step, you know, as you will know, it's a very slow process. And let us not forget, it did take, you know, hundreds of years for other big seismic changes to happen. So what is it that we can do without sort of saying, okay, we want perfection, which is change your business models, et cetera, you know, change the whole way you think about trade unions and all the rest of it. What do you do meanwhile? What sorts of things do you think we should be trying to change that we can do right now?
Yeah, is
there anything?
It's a really excellent question, and it's that kind of like where are the steps before we get to the stuff that we really need. I think one of the things that I'm thinking about more and more is it's interesting. Amelia's talking about a company that it's like very clear they knew that they were sourcing from there. Well, in the UK, our Modern Slavery Act says if people knew or ought to have known that exploitation was being used. And there are lots of cases where I think strategic litigation could be used against companies, and it's just not. What we consistently see is like an individual being prosecuted, right? So I think there could be some really clever legal challenges that simply won't change business models fundamentally, but would, you know, really kind of freak out corporate interests that there is an actual risk here, a legal risk, not just a kind of nice reputational risk. I think that rather than having just this legislation that asks them to publish a piece of paper every year that may or may not contain anything useful, we could be doing more on mandatory transparency, at least, as just like a small thing. So I think publishing factory lists is one of the things that is really quite important and effective when that company is therefore putting itself out to be scrutinized by journalists, by NGOs in country and things like that. And I think that is a really interesting thing, and it shows willing on the part of the company as well to be investigated in that way. So there are these kinds of movements, and then there are kind of second tier ones, like you can limit the number of tiers there can be in a supply chain. They've done it in various countries in particular sectors that are high risk. But then that's again about changing kind of what politically is acceptable in terms of regulation, and we're so far away from that.
Yeah, you're talking about, excuse me, sort of wholesale change in political culture overall, because it's not just in relation to this, as you point out in your book, it's also to do with how we think about migration, our borders, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to move now to Joanna Hewitt-James from Freedom United. So, you know, after this brief conversation, Joanna, with Emily and Amelia, obviously, we all know you've got a really huge job to look at here in terms of trying to free the world of these awful, abusive and exploitative forms of labour. So you're doing quite a lot of work around awareness raising on that front. Does that really help? And if so, how? Can you tell us a bit about how you think that's going to be productive?
Yeah. You know, I think it really is a massive challenge, as we've heard. And I think one of the big problems that we have is this treating the issue as a small aberration that just needs to be solved and brought back into line, when actually it's a lot more fundamental than that. And my question is, this is not new. I mean, exploiting people is as old as history, sadly. Why is it that it still continues today? And the thing that marks out today from, say, history is this complete acceptance of the exploitation of other people, you know, and there's a link in history to how that exploitation has focused on discrimination, on vulnerability, on systemic global systems, on the way that the economy operates. That means that there's been a division, as Emily suggested when she talked about layers and supply chains, between quite often that exploitation and then the person benefiting at the end, you know, even as consumers. And so what we need to do is build an informed and intelligent and accurate understanding of what's actually happening today, because it's outrageous. I mean, the degree of exploitation, the scale of it, is just something that we shouldn't be accepting. And we accept it because I think, for the most part, people don't understand what it looks like and what it feels like and what it is. And we need to bridge that gap between what's happening in reality and what people see at the other end, so that we can make a shift in our social values and make clear that this is not acceptable and it needs to change. If we aren't tuned into what's happening, then of course we can't see an end to it. So the way that Freedom United works is to, you know, share the information, but not to be sensational about it or excessively exaggerating, to really understand, especially from people, you know, who've had lived experience, and to inform ourselves about what's going on and what are these systemic changes that we need to see. Unless we do that and we're clear about what our expectations are in the treatment of others, we can't expect others to follow it too. So we need enough people to say, this isn't on, so that the power holders, be they in government, be they, you know, in the policy positions or in business, they are also reflecting that value, that we will not put the exploitation, we will not put profit above the exploitation of people. So I think that we have some way to go, quite clearly. I think these books are incredibly helpful for exposing what those connections are. But I think it's absolutely possible that we will get there if we do, you know, come together and make clear that, you know, we're looking for that shift in our social values.
Yeah, I like that phrase. I think it's very pertinent, shift in social values, because that's what's needed, social and cultural values, actually, I think. So now we come to the part where we've got questions, and I should say, looking on my screen, I can see that there's kind of loads of people there. And I'm glad I don't have to sift through all of those, because it looks to be around about 70 different interventions on the Q&A. So that's excellent. But we did have some questions submitted beforehand. So I'm going to start with one that I promised I'd come back to, and then I'll go to Emily and ask her to say something on this particular question, which I think is a very interesting one. It's from Chandra Naik. And apologies for any mispronunciations in advance. And Chandra asks, what is the distinguishing mark between modern and old slavery? Is it time or is it mind? I think that's kind of an interesting way of putting that question. So Emily, earlier we touched on this, and I thought you might like to come back and address this specific question.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And there are, one of the kind of proponents of modern slavery as a way of talking about exploitation, and a proponent of the new abolitionist movement overall, an American academic called Kevin Bales, has done kind of tables of like new versus old slavery and like the distinctions between them. So for example, I think one of the things that he has in his binary is that contemporary forms of exploitation are more likely to be shorter term than former ones. However, I think that the whole premise is problematic, and really what we need to think about with regard to historical slavery is that what was abolished in the first half of the 19th century was the legal right to own another person. What was not abolished was exploitation. That has never been abolished. As Joanna says, it's always been part of the human condition. And in fact, this idea that you see all the time in modern slavery language, that it's this new evil, what's it? A new abolitionist says it's a virulent new strain of an ancient evil. That's a quote from someone. And it's this idea, it's this thing that's come back that we abolished. So there's this old and there's this new. In reality, after 1833, when we said, when in the UK, when we made it illegal to legally own someone else, that gave rise around the world to a lot of what we today call modern slavery. So plantation owners freaked out because they still wanted free exploitable labor that they could profit from. And so millions of Indian and Chinese people were shipped to plantations under contracted labor, but effectively under the same conditions as slavery had been, and with this, horrific death rates on the ships, everything that we recognize as being pre-Wilberforce. In the Caribbean, formerly enslaved men were redesignated as apprentices and made to work without pay for 4 to 6 years. So this idea that there's a binary happening, I think, is not really accurate. And really what's shifted is a kind of legality aspect, but running through both is a fact that the way in which we are running our economy globally, and have been for a long time, is premised on there being cheap labor, on there being categories of people who are exploitable, whether that is on racial grounds or on the grounds today where you see companies deliberately citing production in countries with lower labor laws, lower minimum wages, and so on and so forth. So I think that's what we really need to bring into the frame when we're thinking about slavery, the word, and historical slavery, and really interrogate what it is that we're being told when we're thinking about this.
Yeah, that's a good point, I think, and I do agree with you. I've always seen it as more of a continuum than a complete change, and so many of the features are so similar, albeit updated, one might say. So thank you for that. Amelia, I'm going to come to you now and ask you a question, and it does kind of relate to some of the remarks that you were making earlier. It's about why is it so difficult to get a continued outcry against these exploitative, abusive forms of labor? What is it that needs to change in order to make that consistent, our outrage? Because it seems to be so short-lived.
I think just having more people be aware of the actual conditions in these modern slave camps is key. There is prevalent torture of political dissidents. These camps were initially based off of Soviet gulags, so you can imagine the kinds of torture that they go through to receive their so-called re-education. Other populations that are frequently tortured are the Uyghurs and Tibetans and other ethnic groups in China that don't quite fit into what the Chinese state would like to see as become of their Chinese citizens. And when they're not being tortured, sexually abused, and they have to do manufacturing work, making our cheap goods. And so I think if more of us could remember that at the forefront of our minds when we see these ridiculously cheap products, then I think that could be the start to something that may lead to fundamental change towards more transparency. And I wanted to go back to Emily's point about the efficacies of finding a solutions in government versus on the consumer side. And I do agree with what Emily said with the problematic ways that corporations respond to these kinds of consumer activism. There's been a lot of failed efforts on the consumer side to do better in this regard in the past. But I do think it is worth pointing out that I'm not sure about the other parts of the world, but in America, the Gen Z population in particular does appear to care more about sustainability, human rights, and environmental factors and how their products are made, more so than millennials, more so than previous generations. And that is something promising that we could potentially make more use of. For organizations like Freedom United could potentially target these demographics more, because they are actually the largest demographic in the US, and a lot of them are quite young right now, but as they age and gain more purchasing power, you're already seeing a lot of companies take key notes about the trends and the shopping habits of this particular generation that is so social media savvy, so used to calling out companies or politicians that they see not aligning with their values. It's a powerful segment of the American population and possibly the world that a lot of corporations are already putting effort into trying to win them over to join their market base, because they could be potentially really profitable if Gen Z populations think that your brand is cool or sustainable or worth promoting. So we could potentially push that population more to do more in terms of pushing our companies in the direction that we would like to see them go. And unfortunately, that would require doing a lot more than listing the factories that you source from. A lot of companies, as Emily pointed out, don't even do that. But for the ones that do, it's often not enough to just list the factories that you source from. You also need to list what is your relationship with that factory? Are you giving the workers enough prices, a high enough price that they could realistically make that product in-house, or is it such a low price that the factory in China or any other place all over the world really cannot realistically make it in a sustainable way, and they have to outsource work to some really shady places like labor camps where the detainees are not paid for the work or paid significantly below minimum wage for the work. You also have to look at sourcing practices like how much time are companies giving these factories to make their product? Are they trying to take advantage of the latest fast fashion trend, for example, and capitalize that as much as possible by having shorter and shorter and shorter production deadlines? It's so short to the point where a lot of times a normal factory with actual workers who are there on their free will working cannot make it in that time frame, and they have to outsource work to some low quality factories where human rights is not valued, and labor camps where detainees can stay up 20 hours a day to get that deadline done for us as consumers on our end, who are, for the most part, a lot of us are supporting companies that are able to offer the latest fast fashion trends and for the cheapest prices. You're seeing a rise in ultra fast fashion companies like Fashion Nova, which has partnerships with celebrities like the Kardashians and Cardi B, and the CEO of Fashion Nova has famously said to the New York Times that he can turn something from a design into actual clothing in less than 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And how is that made? Is it possible for that short of a production deadline to have it ethically made? And why are they so profitable for having this business strategy? In fact, they're so profitable, these ultra fast fashion companies, that is pushing everyone else in the industry to find ways to cut corners and shorten that production deadline so that they can meet the latest trends for us. And that I think if more socially conscious consumers, especially the loud ones on social media, like the Gen Z populations, are aware of this. I don't think it's just wide awareness among the younger populations yet. About
okay, we've got, sorry to interrupt you, Amelia, it's just that I'm getting conscious of time, but and we have got quite a few questions here, and I've got one that kind of relates to your last point. So if I may, I'll ask Joanna this question, which has come in. I should have said, by the way, the question about why is it difficult to sustain an outcry was from Bashi. And now moving on to a question from Barbara Dickinson for Joanna. And Barbara says, do you think that adding this area of study to the national curriculum, key stages 2 or 3, would help to inform both children and their families and friends about this situation? Joanna, just relatively quickly so I can get some more questions in, please.
I think it is a simple answer. It's a yes. You know, it is astounding that it isn't already on the curriculum, you know, and I think there's so much we could say about that, but yes, the answer is yes. We would love to see it on the curriculum. And I think we need to be having this debate, this discussion at school, at home, you know, around the dinner table. So yes, good idea.
Excellent, okay. Now, I don't know who would like to have a go at this question, which is from Charlotte Maguire. I'm going to summarize it a little bit, Charlotte, so hope I keep the essence of what you're asking. It's about how we can police the supply chain in the kinds of economies in which we exist. How can we monitor what's going on? And given that we're, particularly in Britain, trying to create this hostile work environment and the exploitation of some of the poorest workers, that's made it to the forefront of the media attention. But how do we attack this using the law? Perhaps Joanna, you'd like to kick off on that, and then I'll go over to Emily.
Yeah, I mean, there are opportunities. We're always looking out for opportunities to get amendments to laws or get new legislation in place. We can do it. We have done it. I talked about the time that you and I worked on this, Lola, back in 2009. So, and it happens, and we know how helpful that has been, because since we've got the UK offence of forced labour on the books, it means that there's actually a law for the police to charge somebody against, and an opportunity for someone to get justice. So, you know, these things, they may, obviously in the big picture, they may be relatively small, but they're incredibly important to those people's lives who are able to then take, to benefit from those protections that the law offers. And, you know, I will very quickly say that there's a ton of different options on Freedom United website for laws that we're pushing for right now in the UK on ensuring that survivors of slavery get the support that they should, to global mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence requirements on businesses, that please do take action and get involved.
Thanks, Joanna. In fact, I'm not going to ask Emily to address that question, because I think she did address the issue of legislation in some of her earlier comments, but perhaps she could start off on this question from Ananya Saar, which is, what does modern slavery look like in the developed world, the global north? Emily, how would you respond to that question?
Yeah. Okay, well, a couple of things. I think I'm momentarily going to go rogue and just say that if I were speaking about what we would do legally with the supply chain, it would be partly about enforcement of labour laws, because we have very under-resourced labour inspection, that we're not enforcing the laws that we do have already in place. And as the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking has said, when you have lots of labour abuses allowed to proliferate, you create a breeding ground for the most extreme cases. So I think that's a really important element. Yeah, it's a really, really good question, actually, this one. I really like it, because it leads me to speak about something that hasn't come up yet and that I write about a lot in the book and feel very passionately about. What does it look like in the UK, for example? Well, one of the problems with this whole modern slavery idea is this pervading notion that we need to let groups of people who are at risk of becoming exploited, make them aware that that could happen to them, right? So when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about, say, like homeless people, undocumented migrants would be examples of those categories of people. What their modern slavery would look like could potentially be not very sensational. It could be really horrific, or it could be someone recruiting them from a homeless shelter, saying, I'm going to pay you 50 quid a day. They turn up, that was a deceptive term, and they are then being made to work for £10 a week and have their ID confiscated. For example, that would be a fairly textbook trafficking case in the UK, very similar to lots of things that have happened here. The problem is that what often gets missed when we're like, what do these things look like, is the underlying thing of how it is they've occurred in our like relatively wealthy economies where apparently we have lots of rights. And so we have all this government funded and NGO funded work trying to make, for example, people in homeless shelters aware of the risk of modern slavery so they can spot the signs for themselves. And in reality, very few people are ignorant of the risk of being exploited. You don't just suddenly become ignorant because you're poor or undocumented and lacking in options. What you are is lacking in options. So really what it looks like in the global north are categories of people who've been made vulnerable, either because immigration law makes them illegal or because there aren't sufficient social protections like housing or mental health support. And they've been made vulnerable by political choices, and there aren't good enough options for them to have a decent life, to have good work. So that when someone comes along with a job offer that you and I are lucky enough not to need to say yes to, they have to say yes to that. And that's really what we need to be thinking about, I think, more than like specific sort of cases and like, oh, you know, someone foreign who is poor looks scared, that must be a slave. Let's look underneath that, like why people are vulnerable in these contexts.
Thank you very much for that. We've got time for one more question, which I've picked out of the Q&A. And I'm going to start, I think, with Amelia. And that's about child labour. So I'm not talking, this question isn't specifically around China. Indeed, it's about, well, it was originally about a particular African country, but I think you can extrapolate from there to many places in the developing world where child labour is rife in particular industries, we might say in tobacco, in cocoa. What do we do about that, particularly when there are political / cultural how can I put it, sensitivities, let's say, in trying to address those practices, some of which have been embedded for many years. So I'm going to go, first of all, to Amelia, and I wonder, Amelia, do you have anything to say about this particular area?
Yes, I'm sure Joanna and Emily will have a lot more to say about that. But I just want to point out that in China, there are juvenile detention centers, which I spent time calling and confirming that they are doing manufacturing work and that they are willing to export the products if I'm calling and saying I'm from a fake company that wants to source from them. That's pretty prevalent in China. These detention centers where they have children in labor camps, essentially manufacturing our cheap goods. And when I was in China following the trucks that left these types of camps, they went to all kinds of exporters. There's just so much evidence that they are, you know, there's the physical connections are there if companies want to look for it.
Thank you for that. Yet another sorry tale from that region. So Emily, child labour.
Yeah. Really, I think that the thing we need to do, and we need to do it across everything, but is to listen more. There is a risk, particularly in a country with the kind of history that the UK has. There is a major risk of going in and making assumptions about what's right in other cultures and contexts. That's not to say there aren't problems. Of course there might be, but there has been really interesting research that shows how problematic interventions from, say, the UK in parts of African supply chains have been because of this kind of crusading aspect without understanding the context, or indeed the differences. I was looking at some research a couple of years ago. I was looking at research, I think it was in Ghana, and actually some of the kids had been in agricultural places that was safer than their village at that time. And it's just those kind of things of like, we need to make sure we're never carrying around the arrogance of thinking we know better than people who are actually living in a situation. And I would in general like to see a lot more listening to people in at-risk groups, listening to people in their own context, listening to survivors. Let's listen to people who've been child laborers in these countries. What would have actually supported them and their families for that not to need to be the case? And quite often the answer to that is economic in reality. And the solutions are almost never economic. The solutions are almost always pass a law and then police that law, which doesn't help people put food on their table. So I think listening is really vital.
Yes, I agree with most of that, and we should have a discussion about the other part of it another time, because it is very, very complicated. So, and I think, you know, the history sometimes piles in on that and makes it even more complex to deal with. But I'm going to leave the last point to you, Joanna, because I believe, sadly, it's time to come to an end. And so I'm going to hand over to you, and you can address whatever you want to address in those questions and also close the event. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Massive thank you. I would love to contribute my thoughts as well on child labour, but we are very short of time, and I really want to take this opportunity to thank our fantastic panellists. Thank you, Emily Kenway, whose book, Truth About Modern Slavery, you can get hold of now, it's out. And Amelia Pang, whose book, Made in China, is also available to buy. It was fascinating hearing your thoughts, just hearing about the research and some of those really pertinent points that we really need to think about on this topic. And a very big thanks to our moderator, Baroness Lola Young, for really driving down to the deep reaches of the modern slavery debate today. I think it was a very meaty discussion. I do, before I thank all of the people who have attended, want to last but not least, announce the winner of the books. We did a giveaway, and we have a copy of each book to give to supporters who ask questions. The winner of the book, of Emily Kenway's book, is Ananya Shah. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Her question was, what does modern slavery look like in a developed world? So I'm sure that she's going to find your book incredibly helpful for answering that question. And the winner of Amelia's book is Charlotte Maguire. We actually heard Charlotte's question during the course of the event on how can we police the supply chain of modern slavery in such a political economy. So we will make sure to get in touch with you and get those copies of the book to you. We'll be posting this recording up on our website, on Facebook, and YouTube. You can find it in due course on freedomunited.org/learn. Sorry we didn't get through everyone's questions, but I'm really grateful for your time today joining our discussion. And of course, we very much welcome your feedback. So a big thank you to everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your morning, your afternoon, or your evening, or sleep for those of you who've joined us in the middle of the night. Thank you for attending.